The restaurant glittered with gold and glass, every table glowing under soft amber lights. The air smelled of roses and expensive wine, the sound of live violin music floating gently between murmured laughter and the clinking of glasses. I remember sitting there in my best dress, a deep red silk gown that shimmered with every flicker of candlelight. I had spent hours getting ready, carefully doing my hair, perfecting my makeup, making sure every detail reflected the love I thought we still shared. It was our 10th anniversary, and I believed it would be the night he'd remind me why we started this journey together. I imagined he might hold my hand, whisper that he still saw me the way he did years ago. I imagined a future renewed, hearts healed, and promises kept. I was wrong. He sat across from me, calm, collected, and strangely distant. His smile was practiced, his tone polite, like someone entertaining a business partner instead of his wife. I tried to ignore the coldness in his eyes. I asked about his day, about work, about us, but his answers were short, almost rehearsed. I told myself he was tired. I told myself this dinner meant more than the silence between us. The waiter arrived with our champagne, pouring it carefully into crystal glasses that sparkled under the light. I lifted my glass, ready to toast to another year, but his hand stayed flat on the table. No smile, no gesture, no warmth. Just that eerie stillness before a storm. Then he reached into his briefcase, the one he never left without, and slid a brown envelope across the white linen. I thought maybe it was a surprise, maybe tickets for a trip or a letter, something sentimental. But the moment I saw the legal letterhead, something inside me froze. My hand trembled as I opened it, and as my eyes scanned the words, my heart stopped. Divorce papers. He had chosen this night, our anniversary, to end everything. I looked up at him, my throat tight, vision blurred with disbelief. He didn't even look guilty. His expression was calm, almost relieved, as if he had rehearsed this scene for weeks and couldn't wait to perform it. I wanted to scream, to ask him why, to demand answers, but the words refused to come. I could only stare, feeling the world around me blur. The music, the laughter, the warmth, all of it faded into a distant hum. I could hear only my heartbeat, sharp and unsteady. I saw couples around us smiling, clinking glasses, celebrating love, while mine crumbled right in front of me. The irony was almost cruel. The man I had loved, trusted, and built a life with had chosen the most beautiful night to deliver the ugliest truth. He leaned back, sipping his wine, and said something about, "It's better this way." His tone was soft but detached, like he was discussing a contract, not a marriage. Every word he spoke sliced through me like glass. I kept thinking about the years I'd given him, the sacrifices, the dreams I'd placed second, the way I had believed in forever. And in that moment, I realized he had planned it. The dinner, the setting, the timing, all of it was part of his performance. He wanted me to break quietly, gracefully, in a place where tears would feel like a shame. I sat there, still, holding the papers in my hand, staring at the man I no longer recognized. My reflection in the silver cutlery showed a woman holding back heartbreak, a woman on the edge of breaking apart. But somewhere behind the trembling lips and the shattered heart, something else began to stir, something quiet, sharp, and fierce. I watched him laugh with the waiter as if nothing had happened. He was comfortable in my pain, confident in my silence. He thought I would cry, beg, maybe even plead for another chance. He thought he had taken everything from me. But what he didn't know is that his betrayal was more than an ending, it was the beginning of something he could never control. The dinner continued like a cruel theater play. I moved through the motions, nodding, forcing a smile, pretending to still be the composed, gentle wife he expected. Inside, my heart burned, but my face stayed calm. He wanted to see me fall apart, but I refused to give him that power. Each word he spoke only fueled the quiet fire rising within me. The clinking glasses, the golden lights, the smell of roses, they no longer felt romantic. They felt like witnesses to the moment I stopped being his wife and started becoming something far stronger. The night that was meant to mark the end of my marriage became the night I silently promised myself revenge, not the kind born of rage, but the kind born of awakening. He sat there across from me, his expression unreadable, the faintest smirk playing on his lips as if he was waiting to see how fast I would fall apart. The papers lay between us like a wall, separating the woman who once loved him from the man who now seemed to take pleasure in her pain. I stared at them, the words blurring through my tears, but his voice cut through like ice, calm, controlled, rehearsed. He spoke of irreconcilable differences, of how things haven't been working for a while, as if our marriage was some failed business deal he was finally ready to terminate. His tone carried no emotion, no hesitation, only the arrogance of someone who believed he had already won. Every word left his mouth with such precision that it almost felt like a presentation, not a confession. He explained how he'd already spoken to his lawyer, how the assets would be divided, how he'd make sure I was taken care of. The way he said it, like a transaction, like he was doing me a favor, made my skin crawl. I could feel the sting of humiliation spreading through me, the sharp ache in my chest growing heavier with every sentence. Around us, the restaurant buzzed with laughter, but at our table, there was only cold silence and the echo of betrayal. I tried to speak, to ask him why now, to ask what I had done so wrong that he would choose this night to destroy me, but my voice cracked before it even left my throat. He didn't wait for me to find the words. He just kept talking, his voice steady, almost proud, like he was reading a script he'd rehearsed for weeks. He mentioned her name once, just once, but that was enough. The flicker in his eyes, the smug tone in his voice when he said, "She understands me better," told me everything. There was someone else. Someone who had already replaced me in his world, in his plans, in his heart. My hands clenched around the papers, the sound of the violin in the background suddenly twisting into something haunting. I could feel every beat of my heart pulsing with disbelief and pain. The man I had once thought was my forever was sitting across from me, confessing to betrayal with the ease of someone talking about the weather. And yet, what hurt most wasn't the fact that he was leaving, it was the way he enjoyed my silence. He looked at me, waiting for me to break, to sob, to cause a scene that would justify his decision. He wanted to feel superior, the calm one, the logical one, while I became the emotional mess he could walk away from without guilt. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my composure even as my world fell apart. Every instinct inside me screamed to throw the glass of champagne in his face, to shout, to ask him if our years together meant nothing. But instead, I sat back and watched him. I studied him. The man who once held my hand through every storm now sat there, detached, wiping his mouth with a napkin as if ending a decade of love was just another course in his meal. His phone buzzed once, and I saw the name flash on the screen, a name I didn't recognize, but one that confirmed every suspicion swirling inside me. He quickly flipped it over, pretending not to notice, but I caught the faint curve of a smile before he looked up again. He thought he had all the power, that he had broken me completely. He didn't realize the moment he handed me those papers, something inside me shifted. The woman who once begged for his attention was gone. The woman sitting before him now was quiet, yes, but that quiet was not weakness. It was control. It was the calm before something he would never see coming. As he continued to talk, I could barely hear him anymore. His voice became distant, almost meaningless. My focus had moved beyond the pain, beyond the betrayal. I was memorizing his words, his expressions, every detail of his arrogance. I knew that this night, this dinner, this exact moment would one day become his undoing. I could feel it in the way he leaned back in his chair, satisfied, certain that he had crushed me completely. He believed this was the end. He didn't know it was the start of something else. The waiter returned to clear our plates, and he smiled politely, pretending everything was normal. I played along. I smiled too, not out of happiness, but out of something far colder. I saw confusion flash in his eyes when I didn't cry, when I didn't crumble the way he expected. I thanked him for the dinner in a voice so steady it startled even me. He looked almost disappointed that I hadn't made his scene more dramatic. He had wanted me broken. Instead, I gave him composure. I gave him silence. I gave him the one thing he didn't understand, control. Inside, I was burning, but not with grief anymore. It was a new fire, one that whispered of patience, planning, and revenge. I looked at the papers again, tracing my name written beside his, and I knew that soon he would regret every word he spoke tonight. What he had mistaken for surrender was actually my first move. What he believed was the end of our story was only the opening scene of the one I was about to write, the story where I would rise, and he would finally understand what it meant to lose everything he once took for granted. The tears came quietly at first, sliding down my cheeks before I even realized they had fallen. I sat there staring at the papers, at the man I thought I knew, at the world that had suddenly lost all meaning. Every memory we had built together flashed before my eyes like pieces of a shattered film reel. Our first apartment, the nights we spent dreaming about the future, the promises whispered in the dark. Each one now felt like a lie, every smile poisoned by the realization that he had been planning his escape long before this night. The pain was raw, deep, and silent. I wanted to scream, but the words refused to form. Instead, I sat still, my heart breaking quietly in a room full of strangers. He was still talking, still justifying himself with cold, logical words that didn't match the cruelty of what he'd done. I barely heard him anymore. My mind had drifted somewhere else, a numb space where emotion and thought collided. I watched the candle flame flicker on the table, the golden light reflecting off the diamond ring he had given me years ago. I remembered how proud he was when he slid it onto my finger, how he said it symbolized forever. Now it just felt like a symbol of my foolishness, a reminder of how deeply I had believed in something that never truly existed. The first tear that touched the paper blurred his signature, smearing the ink slightly. For some reason, that small detail pierced deeper than anything he had said. It was proof that no matter how calm he tried to make this process look, it was still human, still messy. I lifted my napkin to wipe my face, trying to hold on to whatever dignity I had left. He didn't even look at me. His attention was already elsewhere, his phone, his wine, his reflection in the polished silverware. I realized then that he had stopped seeing me long before this night. I was no longer a person to him, just a task he wanted to complete. The silence between us grew heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. My mind was racing with questions that would never be answered. How long had he been planning this? Who was she? What had I done to deserve this kind of cruelty? But then, beneath the storm of grief, a new thought began to take shape, something sharper, steadier. The tears slowed, and for the first time since he handed me those papers, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't the kind of pain that destroyed, it was the kind that awakened. I realized that every tear I shed was giving him power. Every moment of silence, every trembling breath, was exactly what he wanted. He wanted me small, defeated, broken enough to walk away quietly while he carried on without consequence. But as I looked at him, so sure of himself, so certain of his control, something deep inside me began to harden. It wasn't hatred, not yet. It was a vow. A quiet promise that this moment would not define me. That one day, he would look back at this dinner and realize it was the biggest mistake he ever made. I straightened slightly in my chair, my tears drying as I took another sip of champagne. The bitterness of it burned my throat, but I didn't flinch. I let it remind me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of something more than despair. I watched him carefully, memorizing the smug tilt of his mouth, the way he checked his watch as if he couldn't wait for the evening to end. He thought this was the last time he'd have to see me weak. He had no idea that the woman sitting before him, the one he thought he had just broken, was already beginning to rebuild herself, stronger, colder, and far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The violinist's melody drifted through the air again, a slow, mournful tune that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. It felt like a funeral song for what once was, but beneath it, I could feel something pulsing, a heartbeat of defiance. I kept my eyes on the candle between us, its flame dancing steadily despite the shifting air. That flame felt like me, fragile, yes, but unextinguished. He might have blown away the life I thought I had, but he hadn't destroyed the fire within me. He had only fed it. As I sat there, the last of my tears dried on my skin. My breathing evened. The shock began to fade, replaced by clarity. The pain would take time to dull, but it would never disappear, and that was fine. Pain could be fuel. Pain could be a weapon. It could carve a new path where weakness once lived. I realized I no longer wanted to understand his reasons or chase his answers. I no longer wanted his apologies. What I wanted was justice, not the kind that shouted, but the kind that watched, waited, and struck when it mattered most. He looked up finally, perhaps noticing the change in my eyes. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but I saw it. That tiny, involuntary hesitation was the first crack in his confidence. And as he looked back down, pretending to regain control, I silently wiped away the last trace of my tears. What he didn't know was that the woman who had walked into that restaurant broken by love was already gone. Sitting before him now was someone new, someone who had found strength in heartbreak and purpose in pain, someone who would never again let him see her cry. That night, after the dinner ended and the world outside turned silent, I sat alone in my car with the divorce papers on the passenger seat beside me. The city lights blurred through the windshield, my reflection fractured across the glass. The humiliation, the betrayal, the sheer cruelty of what had happened replayed in my mind over and over again like an endless loop. Every word he spoke echoed, every smug smile replayed until my stomach twisted. For a while, I just sat there in disbelief, feeling like my life had been ripped apart with a single gesture. But as the minutes passed, disbelief gave way to something else, a calm, deliberate stillness that began to replace the chaos inside me. That stillness carried something powerful within it, the spark of a plan. I thought about everything he had taken from me, my confidence, my years, my trust. I remembered the way he looked at me across that table, so sure that I would walk away quietly. He believed I had nothing left to fight with, no strength to rise again. But he was wrong. I wasn't broken. I was evolving. The woman he had betrayed wasn't coming back, and the one who was taking her place was done being a victim. I started thinking about every way I could turn his arrogance into his downfall. Not through anger or loud revenge, but through strategy, through patience, through elegance. At first, the pain made it hard to think clearly, but the more I remembered his words, the more focused I became. I knew the world he moved in, the people he surrounded himself with, the image he worked so hard to protect. His business, his reputation, his carefully crafted charm, they were all built on perception. He cared more about how people saw him than about who he really was. That became my first advantage. I didn't need to scream or expose him immediately. I only needed to wait for the right time to make his mask crumble in front of everyone he valued. The next morning, I didn't cry. I didn't hide. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. My eyes were swollen from the night before, but behind them I saw something fierce. I had spent years being careful not to upset him, not to argue, not to disappoint. That woman was gone. I opened my laptop, pulled out every document I had ever helped him with: contracts, business records, correspondence. For years, I had been his silent supporter, managing things he never paid attention to, keeping his life organized while he basked in his own success. Now, those same details became my foundation. Every piece of information, every connection, every name that crossed our path, they would all have value. Days turned into weeks, and I began to rebuild my routine. To anyone watching, I seemed calm, perhaps even accepting of the divorce. I went about my life with quiet grace, the perfect image of a heartbroken wife moving on. But beneath that calm exterior, every move I made was deliberate. I reached out to people in his circle, not as his wife, but as someone independent, strong, and suddenly interesting. I learned who admired him, who envied him, and who doubted him. And slowly, I started to weave my plan through those cracks, subtle, invisible, yet inevitable. He still called occasionally, pretending to check on how I was doing, but I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He wanted to make sure I was still defeated, still fragile. I let him believe that. I let him hear softness when I spoke, the kind that made him feel secure. It was important that he didn't see what was coming. Because while he was celebrating his freedom, I was laying the groundwork for something far greater than his short-lived triumph. I started focusing on myself again, Not the version of me he had shaped, but the one I had forgotten. I enrolled in business seminars, reconnected with old colleagues, even started sketching ideas for a project I had once put aside because he told me it was a waste of time. Every step forward felt like reclaiming a part of myself he had stolen. With each small victory, the pain in my chest grew quieter, replaced by purpose. People began to notice. They saw me smiling again, achieving again, standing taller. And inevitably, word reached him. I could tell from the tone of his next call, polite but uneasy. He asked how I'd been, as though trying to read between the lines. I kept my answers short and kind, but my silence said more than words could. I knew that uncertainty was eating at him. The idea that I wasn't broken, that I might be moving on without him, that perhaps I didn't need him after all, it was the first crack in his control. I continued to plan, patiently, methodically. I didn't want revenge born out of chaos. I wanted revenge that was crafted with precision, one that would make him question everything he thought he controlled. My pain had become a blueprint, my heartbreak the ink with which I wrote the next chapter of my life. He had chosen the night of our anniversary to end our story, but I was choosing the rest of the pages. Each day, I grew stronger, calmer, smarter. And deep down, I knew that when the time came, the man who once thought he'd ruined me would finally see what true ruin looked like, not through anger, but through the quiet, calculated brilliance of the woman he had underestimated. It began slowly, almost invisibly, the way a storm gathers far from the shore before anyone notices the sky changing color. My silence after the divorce dinner had confused him. He expected drama, tears, anger, anything he could use to paint me as unstable or bitter. But instead, I gave him nothing. I smiled when I saw him, spoke calmly when we crossed paths, and moved through every conversation with the poise of someone at peace. That calm unnerved him, though he didn't show it at first. He believed I was pretending to be fine. He thought time would make me fade quietly from his world while he continued to build his life with the woman he had chosen over me. He didn't realize that my silence was not surrender, it was the sound of something powerful taking shape beneath the surface. I began to learn more about the empire he had built on charm and deceit. He had made enemies, people who had once trusted him but walked away wounded and silent, just as I had been. They were people who knew his weaknesses, but had never found the right way to use them. I did. I reached out to them discreetly, under the guise of moving forward, of seeking business opportunities, of simply reconnecting. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. Every story, every complaint, every whisper of his manipulations gave me clarity. He had built his success not on talent, but on exploitation. He took credit for others' work, manipulated those who admired him, and discarded them once he no longer needed them. He thought he was untouchable. I began to gather proof quietly, methodically. Emails, contracts, bank transfers, small details that seemed harmless on their own but devastating when placed together. It wasn't revenge driven by rage, it was precision born from patience. I knew the right time would come, the perfect moment to let the truth speak for itself. Until then, I continued to play my part, distant, polite, and seemingly harmless. He believed I had accepted everything and moved on. He even began to speak to me with the arrogance of someone who thought he had won. Each time, I smiled and nodded, my calm expression hiding the satisfaction of knowing I was steps ahead of him. The woman he left me for had no idea what kind of man she had welcomed into her life. She paraded him proudly, flaunting their happiness, believing she had taken something precious from me. I almost felt sorry for her, but only almost. Because I knew the truth, what she thought she had gained was already poisoned. I didn't have to destroy her. He would do that himself. All I had to do was let time unravel him, one mistake at a time, guided quietly by the threads I had begun to pull. The first shift came when one of his business associates withdrew from a major deal. The decision seemed sudden, unexpected, but I knew exactly why. I had shared just enough information anonymously, strategically, to make them doubt him. It wasn't false. It was truth revealed at the right time. And once doubt enters a room, it spreads faster than any lie. Within weeks, I began to see small cracks forming in the image he had built so carefully. Rumors began to circulate, Questions arose in meetings and trust began to thin. He was too proud to admit he was losing control. I stayed quiet, watching from the background. Each piece of information I had gathered was like a carefully placed domino, waiting for its turn to fall. When he called one afternoon, trying to boast about his new beginning, I heard something different beneath his words, a trace of unease. It was faint, but it was there. The tone of a man trying to convince himself that everything was still perfect. I didn't need to say much. I only asked how work was going, and when he hesitated for a fraction of a second, I knew the cracks had deepened. His downfall didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It unfolded slowly, publicly, beautifully. Each scandal, each exposed truth, each whisper of betrayal added to his unraveling. The very people he once manipulated began to turn against him. The partners who once admired him started keeping their distance. And the woman he had left me for, she began to see the truth behind the charm, the lies behind his words. I never had to confront her. The truth reached her naturally, through the chaos he created for himself. I focused on my own life, building quietly but steadily. The business I had once dreamed of started taking shape, fueled by the same intelligence and patience he had underestimated. While his world began to collapse, mine began to rise. Invitations that once went to him now came to me. People began to see me not as his former wife, but as the woman who had built something of her own. My success became a mirror of his failure, reflecting everything he had lost. When his company finally faced public exposure, I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched, calm and composed, as the man who once handed me divorce papers across a candlelit table now struggled to save the remnants of his empire. His confidence turned to desperation, his charm to panic. The world saw him for who he really was, and for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. And though I never said a word, he knew. The way he looked at me when we crossed paths told me he understood exactly who had orchestrated the quiet destruction of everything he once held dear. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was silent, elegant, and complete. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about reclaiming myself, about turning pain into power, about proving that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be while they crumble under the weight of their own deceit. The night I saw him again was unplanned, yet it felt like the universe had decided the moment itself. I was attending a charity gala downtown, one of those elegant events filled with expensive laughter and clinking glasses, where people dressed to impress and hid their truths behind practiced smiles. I had been invited as a guest speaker, representing the foundation I had built, the one that had grown from a small idea I started after our separation into something that now stood proudly on its own. When I stepped onto the stage that evening, dressed in a black gown that shimmered under the soft lights, I caught sight of him across the room. His expression froze the second our eyes met. He looked older than I remembered. The confidence that once radiated from him was gone, replaced by the strained composure of a man holding on to whatever scraps of dignity he had left. His eyes darted between me and the crowd, as if he couldn't quite believe I was standing there, not broken, not bitter, but shining in a way he never thought possible. For a fleeting second, I saw something in his face I had never seen before: regret. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet flicker that told me he finally understood the weight of what he'd lost. As I spoke to the audience, I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. My voice didn't shake. Every word carried the strength of the journey I had walked alone, the strength I had built out of the ashes of what he had destroyed. I didn't mention him, not once, but every success story I told, every lesson I shared, was a quiet reflection of the woman he had underestimated. And as I spoke about resilience, about rebuilding, about finding power in silence, I could see his jaw tighten, his eyes lower. He knew I was speaking from experience, from the life he thought he had ended. When the event ended, people surrounded me, offering congratulations and praise. Cameras flashed, laughter filled the air, and for a while, I forgot he was even there. But as I stepped toward the exit, I felt a familiar presence near me. His voice came softly, hesitant, nothing like the confident tone he used to have. He said my name, and for the first time in years, it didn't hurt to hear it. I turned to face him, calm and poised. The noise around us faded, leaving just the two of us standing in the quiet corner of a crowded room. He tried to speak, to find words that might bridge the space between us, but there were none left to give him. I could see the weight of failure in his eyes, not just the failure of his career, but the realization that his betrayal had cost him something far greater. His downfall had been public, and though he had tried to rebuild, his reputation carried the cracks of the lies he once told. He looked at me as though searching for forgiveness, as though hoping that the woman he destroyed might offer him mercy. But mercy was no longer mine to give. I didn't need to say much. My silence was enough. It carried everything he needed to hear, every sleepless night, every tear, every moment I rebuilt myself without him. The power dynamic had shifted completely. He was no longer the man who had sat across from me at that dinner table with divorce papers in his hand. He was the one standing small, uncertain, while I stood tall, unshaken. And for the first time, I realized that true revenge was never about destruction. It was about transformation. It was about rising so high that the person who tried to break you could no longer reach you, not even with their guilt. He tried to apologize, stumbling over words that once would have meant everything to me. But now they were just noise, empty and irrelevant. I smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of peace. There was no hatred left, no anger. Only closure. I had already taken everything back, my confidence, my independence, my sense of self. His apology couldn't change the past, and my forgiveness wouldn't erase his regret. What remained between us wasn't love or bitterness, it was simply understanding that his greatest mistake had been teaching me how to live without him. As I walked away, I didn't look back. The music swelled, the lights shimmered, and I felt lighter than I ever had before. The revenge I once planned had evolved into something far greater than vengeance. It had become my freedom. My success, my peace, my ability to stand tall in the same world where he had once tried to bury me. That was my victory. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. The city glowed, alive and endless, reflecting back the woman I had become, not a victim, not a survivor, but a creator of her own destiny. Every wound had turned into wisdom, every heartbreak into strength. The story that began with betrayal ended not with anger, but with triumph. Because the truest, most priceless revenge isn't in watching them fall. It's in watching yourself rise, unstoppable, untouchable, and entirely free from the shadow of what they once were.